This is TechTalk Detroit with Brian Spurgeon and Chuck Lobert. TechTalk Detroit brings you the latest in tech news and Detroit happenings every week.
Welcome back to TechTalk Detroit. Happy to have you with us again this week. This time, I'm not doing Brian's job for him. Well, I'm always doing a little bit of Brian's job for him, but he's back from vacation, back from up north. So, Brian, hope you had a good vacation.
I did. Weather was great. Feels good to be back. You know, I heard the podcast kind of floundered a little bit last week, so hopefully we can get it back up to our normal level.
How many times did you complain about the heat while you were up there? That's what I want to know.
You know, I did better than normal, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe it's with age comes a little bit more tolerance, but I don't know. Being on the lake helps. You can kind of just lay in the water all day, so I didn't complain too much.
Yeah, that's good. Well, while you were up there doing that, I think I worked 24 hours a day because I had to do your job and my job. So
I believe that. That I believe.
But I just told everybody not to expect the same level of work this week because you're back. So we thought we would take some time this week and talk about something that's on a lot of people's minds right now is how can I save money? You know, we'll focus in on the IT side of things. You know, how can we cut costs? How can we save money? What can we look at pushing off? Or, you know, how do we kind of take advantage of different things to have less of a capital outlay maybe and turn it into more of a operational expense? So, you know, I thought we would take some time and talk about that. You know, it's a lot of people right now especially are trying to either cut costs or just trying to watch their budget to make sure that they're not overspending, because really we don't know what the next, several months really is going to be like still. So, people are looking at things, looking at their budgets and saying, okay, well, what can we push off to next year? And some are finding that they're going to be in a spot where they have technology, they have infrastructure that needs to be replaced and really can't be pushed off. You know, maybe it's running out of warranty, can't be extended, stuff like that. So really they're in a spot where they have to do something, but, maybe now they're looking at, okay, well, what are my options to be able to avoid this, 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever, $1,000 project to replace my infrastructure. So, I thought we could kind of start with talking about that. And, if you look at that upfront cost, you look at things, you're in a spot where you have to make a change, but you're trying to figure out the best way to do it. What are the options there? So obviously, cloud's a big one. Why don't you talk a little bit? Because it used to be that when we talked about cloud, it really was by far the more expensive way to go.
Absolutely.
So there was only really certain scenarios where you would recommend the cloud because for a lot of people it didn't make sense. But that's changed quite a bit over the past several years, right?
Yeah, I think year to year, if the gap between the cost of hosting your own infrastructure versus going to the cloud is closed significantly, and it seems to keep trending in a positive direction in terms of cost goes. So yeah, I think cloud, when it comes to looking at your infrastructure, you should always be starting and looking at cloud as a potential option. For one, I mean, you're going to get a better security solution. That's one of the biggest benefits. So when you're trying to compare the cost, there is some added value there. And typically, you can also, run your servers on an infrastructure that is going to have some technology that you would never, typically it wouldn't be in the budget to pay for up front. You can run all of your servers on solid state drives in a really quick array where you're going to get a much better read write and speed, especially if you're hosting like a database server. Then, to build that same thing locally, that same server is probably going to push you 100K plus. So I think there is some benefits depending on the scenario. And I think one of the most obvious routes is if you're still hosting your own email, the first step should absolutely be looking at Office 365. The cost monthly between your subscription, I know we've beat that up pretty good in the past, but the per user cost, considering that you get all of the applications, you get your email, it's a no-brainer. And then the added bonus is going to be, the almost 1.5 terabytes of SharePoint storage you get for free. For a lot of small businesses, that's enough to cover the bulk of your data shares. So when you're thinking about your file share server, if you're just running a pretty basic setup, a domain controller, a file server, some email, just moving to Office 365, you might be able to shed the need for on-premise infrastructure altogether. And that would be in terms of cost, I mean, that's an unbelievable savings over time. So I think that's an obvious starting place. But even with the cloud, if you got to run a couple servers, more often than not, a basic server you can run for $300 to $400 a month. With just typical workloads. And then also, if you need to get into a database server, depending on the licensing you have, a lot of times you can run those for, $600, $700, and then certainly on up. So a lot of it's dependent on how much memory you need and hard drive size, but it's certainly worth looking at. I think even if you're looking at over, because we always look at a 5-year solution, a lot of times you might end up paying a little more over 5 years by moving to the cloud, like Azure or AWS, but you're going to save that significant upfront cost. So I think in a lot of ways, it makes sense for a lot of companies. They would prefer to split that cost up over time, and be able to kind of have a predictable cost, not having to fork up that large upfront.
Yeah, and I think you talked about Office 365. It's almost 100% of the time that if you have email internally and you're looking at having to replace that server, buy new software, all of that kind of stuff, it's almost 100% of the time that it's cheaper in the long run and the short run to go to Office 365. On top of that, it's a lot easier to, and a lot less expensive to be able to do true high availability, with whether you're putting servers out in Azure or another cloud, or you're moving your email to Microsoft 365, you're able to spread that data around. I think the last I heard, and this was actually like a year or so ago, just for Microsoft 365, Microsoft was running 11 million servers. So obviously the redundancy that's built into that, the high availability that's built into that, you just can't match it. So
totally.
You can do the same type of thing now if you are talking about Azure, AWS, really any of them, but you can have your data in 2 totally different geographic locations, even if you want. So you can truly get that high availability, and that near 100%, 5 nines, whatever you want to call it, availability. So I think that's super important too, because when you start looking at doing a high availability infrastructure internally, the costs go way up, because now you got to have 2 host servers, you got to have a storage spot, a SAN of some sorts at least. So your costs are obviously going up if you want that high availability. So that's another spot where really the cloud might make a lot of sense. And ultimately, if you do need to bring that infrastructure in-house for whatever reason, maybe you're running a piece of software that's not supported in the cloud, there's always the option of leasing too, which I think a lot of people don't really know about from the IT standpoint, but it's really a great option for people that are trying to avoid that capital expense, but have to have infrastructure, and maybe the cloud's not the right option for them. So that's always a good option too. You can spread your payments out over 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, up to 5 usually. We always just recommend making sure whatever warranty you buy matches whatever, however long your payment is going to be. But usually at the end of those, you pay $1 and you own all the equipment. So that's another good option for people to consider if they are looking at having to do this infrastructure upgrade. It's not something they can push off, but maybe they don't have or don't want to spend that tens of thousands of dollars that it's going to cost.
Yeah, and we have a really good partner we work with for that, and the interest rates are really, really low. So you're talking about getting a few percent interest on that. And again, if you want to get away from this upfront cost, cloud's not an option. You want your own infrastructure. It's a very good way to just spread your costs out over time, and really not have to pay a huge penalty in terms of interest rate. So, with the economy where it's at now, where it's kind of been for a while, the interest rates, like I said, you're looking at a couple 2-3% average, I think, is what we usually see, and it's easy to get it done.
Yeah, and I think where cloud is an option now, there's more options there. If you look at committing to whoever the cloud provider is for an extended period of time. So like
Great
with
point.
Microsoft, that's called reserve instance. So if you say, yeah, I'm going to keep using this for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, your costs go down each time you go up there. So there's more ways to look at it. You can look at your licensing to help you save costs as well, as you mentioned with specifically around SQL. So there's always options there for even looking at the cloud and different ways to save money there as well.
Yeah, the reserved instance is a great way to save money. That's a good point. I think on average, when we try to compare the pricing, if you're willing to commit for that time, if you're willing to go for the 3-year commitment, you usually save about 30% on average. And depending on the type of workload you're setting up, I've seen it go as high as 40%. So, if you know that this application's not going anywhere, you're looking to commit to this, it's a great way to go. And at that point, more often than not, you probably will come out ahead in terms of cost over that period of time, as opposed to buying the infrastructure yourself. So just like you said, it's the gap between the purchasing your own infrastructure and cloud is really, really diminished. And if you have that opinion, that most of us shared several years ago, that the cloud is just very costly, it's definitely time to reevaluate that and at least take a look.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too. You had mentioned that going to the cloud, you get higher security. I know that's kind of a myth that's out there, is that the cloud's not secure, that your data, if it's not sitting within your 4 walls, that you're not going to have total control over it, all of that kind of stuff. So it's important to remember that, if you look at Microsoft, again, that's the partner that we work with for cloud. So that's why I keep bringing up Microsoft. But, they spend $1 billion a year, with a B, $1 billion a year on security. There's no small business that's going to spend obviously anywhere near that. So the thought of, if it goes to the cloud, it's not going to be as secure, is just kind of an old way of thinking. It's just not the case. So it's important to keep in mind too, because to even start to build the security out that you're going to get by going to the cloud, you're just adding more and more cost on to that infrastructure replacement project as it is. And I think the next spot where you really can look at starting to save some money is, either working with an outsourced IT provider for the IT support, or, as we've talked about before, the co-managed IT. If you have a team and maybe you're at that point where you need to look at hiring, instead of looking at hiring another person and bringing on that loaded cost, you can look at working with a partner in that co-managed type scenario. So that's another spot I think that is worth looking at if you're looking at your budget for this year or next.
Yeah, great point. I think there's a couple ways that you can really look at that from a cost saving standpoint. Typically, a company to get the same level of service as an outsourced company like ours would give you have to staff a pretty hefty department. You're looking at probably an expert in security. You need somebody that really understands, the network operations role and can build you an infrastructure that is easily monitored. And when there is issues, you're able to react to them in a proactive manner, as opposed to, our servers are down, let's get them back online. And then plus you need the help desk portion to support the users. And I think where, the second point that you really get into cost savings is when you do in fact need to look at a large project, an infrastructure refresh. If your internal IT team is not trained up on all of the new technology, there's a good chance that they're going to recommend a solution that doesn't take into consideration, like we've mentioned, looking at the cloud. If your internal team has no experience with the cloud, they've never worked with the cloud, and let's just say they have the notion that it's too expensive, not to mention it's extremely hard to just jump in and price it out accurately, they may recommend you not look at that kind of route, when in reality, you might have saved money over a 5-year period if you did make that change. So I think that's where the advantage of, that co-managed is, you can bring in a company, an outsourced company that deals with this stuff all the time. They can work with your team to determine the needs, and they might be able to bring in new solutions that wouldn't have even been on the table and save you there. Not to mention, just from a cost standpoint, if we were to go build an equivalent server through Dell with our partnership level, there's no way that a standalone business is going to build it for the same price. We do so much business with Dell annually. The price breaks we get on this equipment, there's a lot of advantages from a pricing standpoint too, just buying hardware through a company.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think when you specifically look at the co-managed type relationship, you talked about the monitoring and everything, you got to think about all of the costs that goes behind getting that, buying the software, buying the infrastructure to support it, or hosting it in the cloud, the licensing for it, all of that kind of stuff. You're talking, well over $100,000 a year just for that software. So when you look at a co-managed type relationship, you're able to open up access to that level of software and that level of system to your internal team to be able to help them be more effective, more efficient, and everything as well. So it's more than just, not growing your team. It's giving your current team access to make them way more efficient. And in the long run, it's gonna save you way money. And I'm going to learn how to speak here. Way That's more money than it would just simply going out and building it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of advantages to it. It's no matter how you look at it, you can't mirror up the experience that we have. We've talked about in the past. All of our techs, they're training 24/7. We're sending them to conferences. They're doing the latest certifications. Microsoft today just sent me up with a new updates they're doing for their backup and disaster recovery. And I have a webinar on that Tuesday, and it's just a brand new feature that dropped. And within a week, I'm already going to be aware of what the changes are and what we're doing moving forward. So it's just hard to manage that, to get that same level of expertise with just managing your own internal team. That there's just a lot of benefits that they may not directly affect the cost, but in terms of the efficiency you're going to gain, it's just over time, it's not comparable.
Yeah, so I think the common thread we're seeing is that it all comes down to the planning. You got to look at your timelines, you got to look at your budget, you got to consider the roadmap, and you got to figure out what has to happen now, what can be pushed off till we get through this period, however long that is, to feel comfortable again, and what can't be pushed off. Well, okay, now how can I do it the most cost-effective way? And then what can be pushed off, just move it down that roadmap and continue that planning. But really, that's where it all starts is the proper planning, looking at the budgeting. You got to consider the business objectives, you got to consider the budget, you got to consider kind of the state of things that it's at right now to determine what can and cannot wait.
Interact with Tech Talk Detroit at techtalkdetroit.com or on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.